And we're back to learning to code, and this is already the 7th exercise on Exercism, the JavaScript track. It's called Birdwatcher, and it's about incrementation, decrementation, and loops. As always, read through it yourself and refer to this walkthrough when you get stuck. Here is a for loop explained, and we've already been given an example right here. So we're going to define basically a counter called I. Then we're going to compare it to something, and then we'll increment it. We can also subtract numbers from it. And the plus plus indicates the incrementation, minus minus would be the subtraction. It's going to become clearer when we start with task 1. We'll determine the total number of birds that we've counted so far. So we've got an array that has all of the birds stored as a number that we've counted on a given day. And we want to simply have the sum of it. We can use a for loop for that. And usually you'll write it like this. So we need the for and the normal parentheses, the curly brackets. Inside of the parentheses, we'll define the counter. In this case, we'll use I equals 0. Don't forget the let before it. Use a semicolon. We want to compare the I afterwards to something, and then increment it. Inside of the for loop, we've got our code. And after it, we want to return a result. Let me just write something as a placeholder. It needs to be outside of the for loop, but it's inside of the function. So put it right here. How can we now tackle what we need here? At first, we need to define a new variable inside of our function, but before the for loop. Let me just call that total birds. So we want to put the sum of birds inside of it. For now, it's 0. And inside of our for loop, we're going to use it now. And we want to store all of the birds per day inside of it. And in this case, we're going to cycle, you could say, through the different positions inside of our array. So we need birds per day with this I counter. And we'll always, for each loop cycle, we'll add it to the total birds. And you can simply write it like this. So total birds plus equals birds per day and the counter of I as an index. And then we want to return the result, total birds, afterwards. Finally, we'll have to determine when the for loop stops. And this should happen when our counter, the I, is equal or even bigger than the birds per day length. So the I, the counter, starts at 0, and for every cycle 1 is added through the incrementation, and at some point it's going to be as big as our birds per day length, and then the for loop will stop. Let us just go over an example right here, test 1. The array is given with 7 positions. We'll start with the I of 0, which would be the birds per day at the index 0, which is 9. Then it's going to get incremented to 1. It's still smaller than birds per day dot length. Therefore, the for loop is going to continue to the next index position, which is 0, and it's going to add it to the total birds, and so forth. At some point, our counter, the I, will be equal to 7, and this is when it's equal to the birds per day length, and that's when the for loop stops. And afterwards, our total birds, so the sum of all of the birds per day, will be returned. Let us jump to task 2. We'll set up another for loop. It's the same way of writing it. But this time we want to have a specific week analyzed or summed up. In the example, we've got 2 weeks stored in birds per day, so it has 14 positions from 0 to 13 of index, and we only want to count the second week, so this part right here. Therefore we'll have to do something new, but let us first write the typical for loop. And I'll just use placeholders for now. So we need our counter that let I equals 0. Then we need to compare it to something. And afterwards, we'll increment it. Inside of the for loop, we need some code. And then we want to return the result. So for now, it looks like our first example. And you can see we've defined the sum, so the total birds up here before the for loop. So we'll do that here as well. This time I'll call it total birds in a week. And this is what we are going to return ultimately. And within the for loop, we're going to use it to store the sum of birds per day in a given week. So we can almost copy paste this code line from the first task and put it inside of the for loop here. But we'll have to use a different variable, which I have named total birds in week. And birds per day, we'll use our counter di and add the little plus sign right here. Now we'll have to check our conditions for the for loop, how we are treating our counter. It's a good idea to actually write down what we need. So for now, as we've done so in the first task, every position of the index will be summed up. That's not what we need in task 2. So we'll need to find a way to manipulate the counter so that it directly jumps to the correct position for the week. And how can we do that? Well, for the first week, we need the index positions of 0 to 6 to be summed up. For the second week, it would be the positions 7 to 13 and so forth. So we definitely have the number 7 somewhere floating around. So let me put that here. Let I equals 7. For the first week, we know that I needs to start with 0 because we want to have the index positions of 0 to 6. Therefore, we want to multiply 7 with something that equals to 0 so that we have a 0 as a result. And we can use our week parameter right here. And I've said for week 1, it would be 1, and therefore we need -1, as this would equal to 0. And 7 times 0 is 0. So this would give us the right position to start. And if we, for example, have a week of 2, it would be 2 minus 1 equals 1, times 7 would be 7. So this would be the correct index position to sum up the second week birds per day. What we also need to adjust is our comparison. So I is smaller than something. We need to fix that. So for the first week, the counter, the I, needs to stop when it becomes 7. For the second week, it would have to stop when it becomes 14, and so forth. So again, we've got the 7 days per week, the number 7 somewhere. And in this case, we simply have to multiply it by 7. So for the first week, it would be the number 7. For the second week, it will be 7 times 2, 14. Third week, 7 times 3, 21, and so forth. And this is exactly what we need. Let me run it, and we can look at an example. Let's say test 5. Here we have week 2 for birds per day. That means we're going to neglect the first 7 positions, so index 0 to 6, and then we'll use 7 to 13 to sum up our total birds in week. And this is what our counter does. So for week 2, it would be 7 times 2 minus 1, which is 7. And it would stop when it's I smaller than 7 times 2, 14. Let's go to task 3. This time we've got a bird that we wanted to add every second day. It starts on day 1, then day 3, day 5, day 7, and so forth. So we'll need the index positions of 0, 2, 4, 6, and so forth. At first, once again, we'll create our for loop. I'll use a couple of placeholders, and then we'll go over it. How can we now address that? We can directly use our birds per day array, and then we want to +1 at a given position. So we can write it directly like this. Birds per day with the counter I for the index plus equals 1. But for now, this loop would add 1 to every position. Instead of doing this, we want to have it only add +1 to every second position. Therefore, we'll have to increment it a little bit differently. But at first, we'll need to find an end to our loop, and this is once again the birds per day.length. And for the incrementation, instead of I++, which would equal to I plus 1, we'll just write it like this, I equals I plus 2, or we'll just write I plus equal 2. And this would increment it by 2 every time the loop is cycled through, which makes it jump to every second index position in our array. Let me run it. And that was correct. Let us just check an example, test 9. So we'll start at I0, index position 0, which is the 2, it gets +1. Then it's going to get incremented by 2, so we'll directly jump to index position 2 instead of 1, and so forth. And this is how you can solve the birdwatcher exercise in JavaScript on Exercism. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.